G'day guys, week 2 of our series, Keep the Change. If you're at home, share us with your friends, like us, and subscribe so you get the notifications during the week. Today's awesome worship partner is another newie. It's Gateway Church coming from Texas.
The King of awesome majesty, the one who reigns eternally, forevermore. Creation sings, how glorious, how glorious, the King of awesome majesty. how glorious.
1, 2, 3. When I'm in the roughest water, I won't go under, I won't drown. And when I'm in over my head, I know that you won't let me down. And when I'm broken and down to nothing, I know that you are always up to something good. I know that you are always up to something good. You make a way whatever it takes. There's nothing your love won't endure. I know that you are always up to something good. Even through the deepest valley, you go before me, you are here. For I know you'll never leave me, your love surrounds me, I won't fear. And when I'm broken and down to nothing, I know that you are always up to something good. I know that you are always up to something good. You make a way whatever it takes. There's nothing your love won't endure. I know that you are always up to something good. Through the darkest night, you are on my side. You are always faithful. Through my fear and doubt, you will lead me out. You are always able. Through the darkest night, you are on my side. You are always faithful. Through my fear and doubt, you will lead me out. You are always able. And I know that you are always up to something good. I know that you are always up to something good. You make a way whatever it takes. There's nothing your love won't endure. I know that you are always up to something good. You make a way whatever it takes. There's nothing your love won't endure. I know that you are always up to something good.
If you missed last week, feel free to head back and check out week 1. Today is week 2 of Keep the Change, once again taken by our very own Mark Pomery.
Hey, a shout out to our Elevate Online family. Great to have you with us here today. And I want to give a special shout out to Alice, coming all the way from Kenya in Africa. Alice is with us every single week for our online experience. And Alice, I wanted you to know that your son gave me some of the tea that is produced locally in your region, Kariko or Caricho Gold. So thanks to you, thanks to Michael, your son, you raised a good boy there. So hey, every year we teach a series on money and stuff, and it's very intentional why we do that, not least of which is because God has a lot to say about the topic. Jesus had a lot to say about the topic, but really probably for the same reasons they spoke so much about the topic of money and stuff. And that is that money and stuff is often, at least in the top three, and very often number one competitor for our attention and our priorities. And the thing about that is that God doesn't want anybody or anything to knock him off that number one spot. And so we teach that, and we use the series on money and stuff every year to recalibrate our hearts, recalibrate our priorities. Also to learn practical skills. God has a lot of very practical wisdom, practical principles that we can apply into our everyday lives and how we manage the money and the stuff that God's entrusted to us. So super important. And last week we launched our 2021 series around money and stuff called Keep the Change. And this is a 3-week series. So we launched last week. This is week 2. And then we're going to land the series next week. But last week I spoke a message called Take Control of Your Money. And this was just a simple flyover of what I would consider God's top 5 principles for managing money and stuff. So if you missed that message, Take Control of Your Money, then go back either on our YouTube channel or our podcast and get your head around that, because that's really the jump off point for this series. Super, super, super important for us to understand God's top 5 principles when it comes to money and stuff. Now, whilst God has a lot to say about money and stuff, the reality is that we essentially live in a culture that is constantly talking about money and stuff. And not everything the culture we live in says about money and stuff lines up with what God says about money and stuff. In fact, sometimes they're actually in direct competition. And some of the things that our culture tells us about money and stuff, if they don't line up with what God says, and we make the mistake of choosing to listen to our culture rather than listening to God, then we're not going to get the sort of results in our lives that God wants for us. And so I want to just expose some of the things that really are different from what God says. Essentially lies that we can get sucked into believing. And some of these are subtle, and some of these are overt. And the problem with the subtle ones, and maybe even the overt ones, the problem with some of these lies is if you've grown up in this culture, the longer you're in a culture, the less you notice its quirks, the less you notice the kind of unusual things about it. It's like the saying, a fish doesn't feel wet, because that's the fish's only frame of reference. And so if you've been raised in a culture, particularly an aspirational, materialistic culture, like the Western culture, and also, that's coming on in other cultures around the world, you can miss the cues, you can miss the messages, you can miss things because they just seem normal. They just seem like that's just kind of how it is. And so if you do that, if you listen to and adopt the things that our culture teaches and advocates about money and stuff, where those things differ from what God says, then you're vulnerable to missing out on the better that God has for you. So here's one. You'll be happy if you buy, and then fill in the blank. If you buy the newer car, if you buy a bigger house, if you buy those shoes, then you'll be happy. And the problem with this is that in the moment that you then take that message on board and act on it, you've actually handed over your contentment to the marketers and the sellers of the thing that you're going for. And what you'll soon discover is, whilst those objects aren't evil, and I'll come back to a little bit more about this later, you'll soon find that our culture tells us there's no finish line. Because just when you've bought that, just when you've acquired that, just when you've moved into that, just when you're starting to drive that, then there's the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. And you'll find yourself on a treadmill with no finish line. A treadmill that says, keep buying more. A culture that says there's no such thing as enough. And because of that, we need to define our own enough. We need to answer the question for ourselves, how much is enough? Because without answering that question, someone else is going to answer it for you, and they're going to tell you there's no such thing as enough. And if you believe that there's no such thing as enough, you will never feel the contentment and the peace and the joy that God has for you. So we need to make sure we define our enough. Jesus, addressed this because it's not necessarily a new problem. It's more about the human heart, which hasn't changed for thousands of years. And this is what Jesus said. Speaking to the people, he went on, take care. Protect yourself against the least bit of greed. Life's not defined by what you have, even when you have a lot. And then he told them this story. The farm of a certain man produced a terrific crop. And he thought to himself, what can I do? My barn isn't big enough for this harvest. And then he said, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And then I'll gather in all my grain and goods. And I'll say to myself, self, you've done well. You've got it made, and now you can retire. Take it easy and have the time of your life. And just then, God showed up and said, fool, tonight you die. And your barn full of goods, who gets it? So that's what happens when you fill your barn with self and not with God. Now, some of this is fueled, some of our kind of compulsion towards always wanting more and thinking we need more and not having enough and believing the lie that there's no such thing as enough. Some of that comes from marketing, being told things, read things on television, commercials, etc. Some of it comes from comparison, us looking around at other people and thinking, well, they've got it, and I think if they look like they're enjoying it, and so if I get it, then I'm going to probably feel like they're feeling. And then there's this new phenomenon called social media, where marketing has now gotten married to comparison. And this saying, keeping up with the Joneses, we are now carrying the Joneses around on our phones, in our pocket, everywhere we go. So we are constantly being shown what the Joneses are doing, what the Joneses have, who the Joneses are trying to impress. And that is a very, very, very slippery slope. And I'm not poo-pooing social media. I love a good cat meme. I like some of the things that are encouraging on there. But just be aware that there's a thread, particularly with influencers who are often paid and you don't know they're paid much of the time, to tell you, you'll be happy if you buy this. Here's another lie our culture tells us about money. You don't need anyone else. I talked a bit about this last week, the importance in our sphere of developing and cultivating high-quality relationships, especially with people who are managing money the way God has instructed us to manage money. Because our sphere normalizes our perspective. Our sphere tells us what everyone's doing. And of course, it's not everyone, but it's our sphere, and that gives us the frame of reference. And so having people in your sphere who are managing money and stuff in a God-honoring way helps you have a frame of reference. And if you're not yet managing money and stuff in a God-honoring way, then get with these people and pick their brains. Ask them what they do. Ask them when, go back in their history where they've maybe not been so good at managing money and stuff, and ask them what lessons they learned and how they applied it, and give us the backstory. Tell us about your journey. Friends, good, high-quality relationships can offer this to us. Some of you maybe need to access some professional assistance when it comes to managing money and stuff. Maybe you are just in way over your head. You've accumulated debt. You're living paycheck to paycheck. The calendar runs out. The bank account runs out before the calendar runs out each month, and you're kind of at a bit of a loss. Well, there are professionals that can help you. A family in our sphere, probably about this time last year, they despite both husband and wife working full-time jobs, they were literally getting by paycheck to paycheck or pay period to pay period. And occasionally things would get grim where they didn't even make it to the next pay period. And they were kind of tearing their hair out. They didn't know why. They were working hard. They were in decent paying jobs. And so we were able to connect them with a financial advisor who's a friend of ours and someone that we've worked with for many, many years. And he, sat down with them and he says to them, show me everything. I need to see everything. I need to see pay slips. I need to see mortgage statements. I need to see utility bills. I need to see grocery receipts. Get out the shoe boxes, get out the bank statements, get it all out and put it on the table. I need to see everything. I need to see why this isn't working for you. And he didn't want to expose their financial situation to shame them. He wanted to expose their financial situation to help them. And he was able to crunch the numbers and help advise them on where they could save some money, where they could restructure their loan situation, where they could consolidate some things. And in the process of meeting with him, they begun the process of getting unstuck, begun the process of getting out from under this burden of not being able to make it on their financial journey, because they learned the lesson that it's critical on our financial journey not to travel alone. Now, let me add a little bit of bonus content here. Those of you who are married and you and your spouse are miles apart when it comes to how you should, as a couple and as a household, manage money and stuff, please don't ignore that. Don't just sweep that under the carpet. Don't just pretend that that's not a problem. Even if everything else in your marriage is great, that one thing has the potential to undermine your relationship. It has the potential to set your kids up with an unhealthy relationship with marriage. Because the reality is often in marriages, this whole thing of opposites attract can be true in how we approach money and stuff. One's the spender, one's the saver. One focuses on let's just spend on needs, and the other one's like, no, I think we should spend on some wants. You might define enough differently. How much is enough, how much is too much. You might even have some family of origin differences where you grew up in just very, very, very different households. And the perspective you've brought to your marriage on managing money and stuff might be problematic. So, in that case, you might need some professional assistance, but it might not necessarily be from a financial planner. It could be from a great Christian counselor who can help you guys get unstuck and set you free in your marriage and then for the generations to come. Okay, third lie that our culture teaches us is this: your net worth equals your worth. Because think about it. Money is one of the few elements in our life that effectively presents a scorecard. The reference point is the more you have, the more you're worth. And not the more you have, the more your bank account's worth. There's actually something in our culture that looks and says the more you have, the more you must be valuable in society. And people aren't going to ask you for your bank account, at least not in Australia. We would say that's un-Australian. But they would still, some of them might look at what postcode you live in and draw some conclusions about you. They might look at what size of house you live in and draw some conclusions about you. They might look at what car you drive and draw some conclusions of you. Just recently, Mother's Day, in fact, I don't own a car, so there you go. That's how much importance I place on a car. I drive a Vespa, or I ride a Vespa. And so I was scooting home from having visited my mum for Mother's Day lunch. And that Sunday afternoon, scooting home, I looked in the distance, and the next set of traffic lights was turning red. And there was a car pulling up in front of me, but about 100 meters in front. And from behind, it looked like Louisa, my wife's car, the Louis-mobile. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, because she'd gone to see her mum for Mother's Day lunch. I'd gone to see my mum for Mother's Day lunch. And I'm thinking to myself, what are the chances of the two of us having just coincidentally arrived on the same road and being ready to pull up behind her at the traffic lights? And so I'm ready to, toot my little Vespa horn when I got in behind her. And then I pulled up within about 10 meters. This might be a function of my poor eyesight. Only to discover not only was it not Louisa, not only was it not the Louis-mobile, it wasn't even the same make or company of car that she drives. In fact, it was the Audi cousin of the car that Louis drives. In fact, one of Louisa's colleagues, who's a car guy, he regularly jabs her about her car and calls it a poor man's Audi. And I say to him, tell him it's actually not a poor man's Audi, it's a wise man's Audi. And here's why. This is two cars. One is the Louis-mobile, or at least the same version. And the other one is the one, or a version of what I pulled up behind at those traffic lights. One's a Skoda, that's the Louis-mobile. One's an Audi, that's the equivalent of the one I pulled up behind. Important to know that both Skoda and Audi are owned by the same parent company, Volkswagen. That these two cars are built on the same chassis, that these two cars share the same internal technology. And yet the Skoda is priced here in Australia at $27,000. And the Audi is priced at $47,000. In other words, our culture has given a different value to two cars that are almost identical in every single way. And then drill that down one level more, our culture has actually ascribed a different value to the people who drive the Audi versus the Skoda. And just, by the way, I think it's the opposite. I think it's the wise one, and this is why I tell Louisa, tell your colleague it's not a poor man's Audi, it's a wise man's Audi, because why in the world would you pay $20,000 more for, almost twice as much, for the exact same car? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because we live in a culture that says that your worth is determined and demonstrated by your net worth. Now, it's important for me to say this. God has no real problem against you having a nice car. And if cars are your thing, they're not my thing, I don't own one, but if they're your thing, I'm not trying to yuck your yum. I am simply saying this, and this is how I would distill God's perspective on stuff and on having some nice stuff. And that is a green light on having some nice stuff, but make sure that in your heart, your nice stuff doesn't have you. That your value and your worth and the value and the worth you see in other people is based on how God sees them, not how the car dealerships or the person driving down the road or the TV commercials see them. You know, Jesus said it this way: you can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration of one feeds contempt for the other. You can't worship God and money both. Now, he didn't say you can't have God and money, but he said you can't worship God and money. So we are invited and challenged to worship God and manage money, not worship money and then manage our relationship with God. God's number one. Keep him number one. Worship him. Put him first in everything, including how you manage money and stuff. And here's, I think, the big antidote. And we shared this last week. And this is our biblical pattern. It's the antidote for ensuring that money doesn't get ahead of God in terms of our priorities, in terms of who we worship first. And it's this simple principle: give, save, live. And so if after you've given into the kingdom, being generous towards others with your finances, after you've saved and invested, make sure you've paid yourself something for the work that you've done, then the rest is for you to live off. And if you've been left with enough to live off that you can go and buy an Audi, if that's what spins your propellers, then go for it. But don't get those things in the other way around, that it's live first, save and invest second, and then maybe give at the end, because that in effect is putting God at the end of the queue and everyone and everything else ahead. We can't have God and money, but we can't worship both God and money. And so next week, we're going to land this series, Keep the Change, and I'm going to teach about how to be rich towards God. So I would love to see you back with us next week. I'd love you to invite somebody, sit on the couch with you, maybe have a little watch party, put on some snacks, some coffee, and really, let's be proactive about reaching out to our sphere to ensure that they too are learning how to manage money and stuff in a way that honors God. So God bless you. We'll see you again next week.
Head over to our Elevate Church AU app, where you can find the Elevate group notes, where you can dig in by yourself or with a mate during the week. If you're at home and you want to help us reach into and build into people all around the world, the ways to give can be found just below. Go on and have a great week from all the team at Elevate Church.